Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode on how to be more effective at your daily work. I am joined by Bruno Ferrari, like the car, and he's a director at OptimalWork. And today we'll be diving into what does it mean to work optimally, and how do we become more effective in our day-to-day work, and how do we improve our work habits so that we actually produce better work, as basic as it sounds. So Bruno, if you don't mind just sharing with us, what is the history of optimal work and how did you become involved with it?
Sure. Yeah. So it's an exciting journey, actually. So Dr. Kevin Majors, who is a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School on the faculty, actually had a psychiatry practice that he was running besides doing his teaching at Harvard Medical. And during that time, he did a lot of exposure therapy with clients, helping them address anxiety in particular. And what he would do is he would help them face that anxiety by reframing their experience and entering into it. And what he found at the same time, he was running a mentoring program for students at Harvard, MIT, and just the local schools here in Boston. And he was finding that a lot of the principles that apply to psychiatry and to his work as a psychiatrist were transferable to the students and the work that they were doing at school, helping them to engage more fully in their work, helping them to not give into things like distraction or even procrastination. The same principles that were applied in his practice were actually helpful for those students who wanted to work more optimally and more effectively in their studies. And so that's really the genesis of optimal work. It came from his experience in the practice, his research in neuroscience and behavioral psychology, and then all of that connected to classic virtue theory.
Wow. No, that's really interesting. When I first learned about optimal work, it was like the answer to something that I've been looking for a long time. Like, how do I become better at my daily job in like a practical way? Like, what are some habits that I can put into place to relieve that anxiety, to relieve that feeling of being overwhelmed? So I'm really just excited by the work that optimal work does. So how did you get involved with them?
Yeah, so I worked for a few different years for an organization called Focus, and my first assignment was at Harvard. So I was working with students at Harvard, mentoring them. And during that time, I came in touch with Kevin and learned a little bit about the work that he was doing and was just absolutely captivated by the impact that it had on me, but also on a lot of the students that I was journeying with. And so that was my first encounter probably about 7 years ago. And then over the years, I stayed connected a little bit. And as optimal work grew, so did my interest. And yeah, so just recently in January, I joined the team full time.
Oh, that's exciting. So, okay, for those that who don't know what optimal work is as an organization, can you describe what it is and yeah, what is the mission?
Absolutely, yeah. I would say fundamentally, optimal work is about taking people on a path towards self-mastery. Self-mastery in their work, but not just in their work, also in their entire life, really. And so there's really three elements when we think about self-mastery. Number one, it all begins with our attitude. How do we master our attitude? Secondly, it's mastering our attention, our capacity to stay on task. And then finally, it's our actions. And so those are really the elements of self-mastery that we see as critical for anyone to really grow and embark on this journey. And so we describe them as well as reframing, mindfulness, and challenge. Reframing is what we have to do with our attitude to be able to see the opportunity that lies in every task. Mindfulness is really the capacity to stay on task instead of multitasking. We have this term we like to use as unitasking, being present to the one task. And then finally, challenge, being able to really engage in our actions in a meaningful way that stretches us to improve. One way that I like to describe it, Valentina, is optimal work. You know, there's transitive and intransitive goods, and this is a little philosophical here, but oftentimes in our work, we're just trying to get something done or to achieve an outcome. And we forget that our work actually is the perfect opportunity for our own development. And so there's an intransitive element to our work. In other words, there's something that changes within us as we're working better and more effectively. Not only do we produce more, which is kind of a byproduct, but we ourselves become better people. And so it's really, in short, I would say the training grounds for virtue.
Yeah.
It's really our path to holiness is what are we doing in our day-to-day life? And we spend so much time working. So I think it's a
Yes.
question worth exploring and thinking about. How do I think about my work? How do I approach my work? Is it just something I need to get done, or do I actually see it as a path for my transformation, my sanctification?
Yeah, that is something that I'm so fascinated by, like especially the element of virtue. So in your just in what you've described, and maybe you could break this down even more, like what is the purpose or a higher goal of working optimally? Like why does it matter? Like why does it matter if I put in 100% at a project that I'm doing versus just going through the motions so I can just go home and binge on Netflix? Like why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, since I know that the podcast, the audience it would understand a little bit of theology in here. I mean, if we go back to the account in Genesis, man was put on earth, we're in the garden to work. Ut operator is the Latin, right? We were put in there to work, and
Mm,
so there's the reality that work is what we do so much of our life, right? I mean, when Adam is in the garden with Eve, like he's there, and in really what as he's naming the animals and the different creatures in creation, there's this sense of gaining mastery,
mm,
becoming a steward of the gifts that he has received.
yeah.
And so the same is true for us. I mean, work is the place where we deploy our capacities to affect a change in the world. And ultimately, that should be a change that is one that brings about love and service, right? Which we call the highest ideals. And so work matters because it's the playing field where we live out these ideals that we have. It's where our ideas become action. It's where we translate our thoughts and inspirations into reality. And we have a chance to really shape the world through our work. And so ultimately, the higher goal of optimal work is to help people connect their work to the highest ideals possible, right? And those are love and service. If you can connect your work to ideals of love and service, then ultimately you're maintaining not only a connection to God, because that's pleasing to Him, but
Mm,
you're also more engaged and satisfied with your work, because that's what we were meant to do. And
yeah.
so we talk a lot more in optimal work about bonds, and so the importance of bonds. Ultimately, our work is relational. Whether it might seem so or not, you might be a software engineer, or you might be in some kind of environment where you don't have direct contact with a large group of people. But eventually, if you go high enough, you recognize that all of our work is meant to be of service to someone else.
Yeah.
Um, and so that connection to the bonds that are inherent in any job are really critical, and they help us work better. And so what's fascinating is that optimal work ultimately helps people to recognize that their best work and most effective, efficient, productive work ultimately will come from having their job, whatever it might be, tied to ideals of love and service, tied to
Mm.
some bond, tied to some gift of self ultimately.
So what would you say to somebody who's hearing this and they're like, yes, like this makes sense, but I'm in a job that is so mundane, or I'm like bored to tears. Like what would you say to somebody who can't, it's maybe hard for them to see how their work might be impacting other people, or even yeah, like what the higher call could be? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, it begins with reframing, right? Thinking about the task at hand. And I think there's a difference between just positive psychology, positive thinking, and reframing. There is the reality that certain jobs, and really all jobs, have certain tasks that are more taxing, less enjoyable, maybe more just more difficult, that demand more from us. But I think this all goes back to recognizing that our work is not like an enemy that we have to like fight and conquer and get. It's actually really a tool for our own development. So
Yeah.
what I would say to that person is really to focus on the intransitive, as I was saying before. What is it that this job presents to me as an opportunity for my own development? So for example, let's say, my job it feels so tedious and I have to do something repetitive and I don't see the meaning in it. It's okay. Well, this might be an opportunity for me to grow in resilience, in constancy in my work. And not just in my work. Whatever I'm doing in my work ultimately will translate to the rest of my life. And so these are the kinds of connections that in optimal work we think it's so important to help people make, to step back and not just think about the outcome of the job, but on a bigger scale, to see how that job is transforming them as an individual, and also how it might connect to service to somebody else. I can think of another example. Let's say maybe you're working for FedEx and you're just moving boxes all day, and it's just not a task that you enjoy that much. But if you take the time to think, okay, maybe it's the Christmas season, and maybe the boxes that you're moving are carrying the gifts that parents and children are going to be enjoying the next day. All of a sudden, if you think about it in that way, you can do the task with a little bit more love and perhaps a spirit of cheerfulness. So those are the sorts of connections that we help people to make.
Yeah, no, and that was an interesting example that you brought up. So during the Christmas season, I remember driving down the street and I passed by like a local trucking company headquarters, and they had an actual semi truck parked out front, and then it said, "You should thank a truck driver for your Christmas gifts this year." I was like, "Oh my gosh, that is so true!" like when I see them on the highway, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you're so big." But now I'm like, "Oh wow, like thank you for moving my packages." So it makes sense. So as part of what optimal work does, there is something that is coined the golden hour. Can you explain what that is and how that becomes a way to grow and to grow in self-mastery?
Yeah. So we always say optimal work theories are great, they're fun, but behavioral change, that's what really matters ultimately, right? Love is deeds, not just sweet words. And so that's what the golden hour is. It's an individual's opportunity to practice all of the parts of the optimal work theory of growth in a deliberate, carefully curated hour of work. And it doesn't have to be an hour. It could be 40 minutes, 60 minutes, but it's a time set aside to really shape your work. Really what we help people do during the golden hour is to create a perimeter around their work, and to see it, or to reframe any obstacle that they might encounter in that work, to set the conditions for mindfulness in that work by being present, and really to harness their full attention and challenge themselves in the very substance of that time of work. And so, I think I mentioned I worked for Focus for a while, which was a missionary organization that I was a part of. And in that organization, we were talking to people about God. And so we had a holy hour. And so there was a time set apart where we would really engage in our relationship with God to be able to then pour out during the rest of our day. In a similar way, the golden hour is that time that's set apart to really deliberately shape a time of work, to connect that time of work to your highest ideals, to think about it, to prepare for it, and then to enter into it and give it your all. And what we found is that if you're able to do that for 1 hour, it translates to the rest of your day, and not just to the rest of your day in terms of your work day, but also into the rest of your relationships.
I totally agree with that. And so before this call, I actually went through like a trial version of optimal work, like the master class. And so as part of it, you're required to list a project that you want to complete or something that you want to do. And I was just really impressed at how well done it was in terms of first going through the process of reframing me to like, what is the higher goal, and how can I, like, who is this going to benefit, or how can I think of it in a way that I'm working for something else or for someone else. And then I really appreciated the time of mindfulness where there was a countdown. I think it was Dr. Kevin Major who was going through and just like counting down your breathing and just going through that process. And then the last part about what is the challenge that you had to do. And so I listed those, and then there was a timer set as to, okay, I'm going to complete this work that I need to do in an hour. And I will be honest, like initially, like, okay, yeah, this is good. I'm going. But I realized how easy it was for me to get distracted. Like, I was like, oh, I don't need to turn my phone off or put it on silent. But as soon as the first text message came, I was like, oh, what's this? Or like, I closed most of my browsers, but not all of them. And I found myself like almost like desiring to be distracted. So it was a really like an eye opener to how much this kind of work or this kind of focus is important. Have you found that in your own life, or like what are some of the strategies that you've since incorporated that have benefited you?
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing the power of awareness that you gain the moment you set a clear goal for yourself. I think so many times we just dive into our work, have to start responding to emails or, multitasking, going from one thing to the next. And the moment that you really set an intention clearly for a time of work and set a perimeter of what am I actually going to try to get done during this work hour or however long the period of time is, you are more aware of the pull to step out of that, right? So you're more aware of like,
Yes.
oh, actually, I'm breaking this perimeter that I had set for myself. And that's already a path of growth. At that point,
Yeah.
that experience is already a moment of growth because it all begins with awareness. The same thing happens with mindfulness. Like the moment that you stop before your time of work and really try to gather all of your attention, by this simple breathing exercise or whatever it might be, you see how the thoughts are kind of rushing through your head. And a little bit, actually, that's something that we talk about, I think in the master class, cognitive fusion sometimes is what happens when we just are so tied to our thoughts that they kind of throw us around from one thing to the next and make it hard for us to be focused in the work that we're doing. And so the habit of mindfulness is what allows us to be a little bit more separated from our thoughts in a positive sense, to allow them to just kind of pass by, but to maintain our attention on the task at hand. And so, yeah, I think for me, to get practical in terms of strategies, I mean, I think really recognizing that not every hour of the day at times can I be doing a golden hour, but to just have a period set apart where maybe I'm doing more of my creative work or just my most important work that day. Maybe it's preparing for a meeting. Maybe it's, reading a few different articles that I have to gather some information from. To take the 10 minutes or 5 minutes to just prepare for that time of work and to think deliberately about what I'm trying to achieve, to set a goal so I can stretch myself, kind of like a pole vaulter would do, right? It's like, it would be crazy to think of a pole vaulter that would just go and then jump without having an actual, bar that they're trying to cross over, right? Without hitting, like they have to set a bar somewhere. And so part of what the golden hour is helping you set that bar for yourself. And it's very satisfying to be able to go over the bar, and to be able to challenge yourself in that deliberate way. And so for me, it's as simple as spending a few minutes to think about, okay, what is it that I really want to achieve in this time of work? And how can I strategize that time of work? A lot of the work that we do is with students. And I'll just give one example. Students spend so much time reading. You think about how much time you spend reading, and it's easy to just think, oh, I have to go do my reading again. But to not give any thought as to how we're retaining the material that we're reading, how do we actually read through it? Is there a more effective way to do that? Could I be taking better notes? Could I think about how I might cover more information and retain more of it? So there's goals that are linked to quantity, but also to the quality of our work. And that's where we become, kind of like co-creators. It's so exciting to be able to create in a way like your time of work and to think of new strategies. And so, the golden hour is all of that. It's just helping you to engage in this exercise of thinking more deliberately about how you're shaping your time of work. And to set those boundaries in place that allow you to enter into your work time as well.
Yeah, gosh, that reminds me of a podcast episode that I listened to, and that's called The Golden Hour that OptimalWork has, about how like if we think in advance and strategize in advance as to how we're going to complete something, then we're not just reactive like in the moment. We're actually like intentional. And I think that's just for me, that was a new way of looking at work. Like I tend to be reactive just with different phone calls I'm on or emails that come through, that when I do have those moments of like, okay, this is going to be a planned moment of work and this is what I want to accomplish it, I far exceed my own expectations and it's just a better result in the end. But I just like that it makes you pause and to just really think like, what is it that I want to accomplish here? So
yeah, it's so helpful, especially in this day and age where we are just so distracted as a people. I mean, there are so many things that can distract us and pull us in different directions. And to achieve something of meaning, it's necessary to step away from that for a little bit, to be able to protect one's mind, to enter into something more fully, and to give all of one's energies to one task.
yeah. So related to that, and maybe even a little bit different. So as part of the getting ready to work, there's a part of like finding your purpose for doing something before you start. And we talked a little bit about this, but can you just explain like what is the benefit of setting an intention, or just like why you're doing this and knowing why you're doing this before you do it?
Yeah, that is ultimately what's going to drive you in the moments of, if we can call it temptation during the task, like, if you want to abandon the task, or you're less driven to complete it, it's so helpful to remember your why. Simon Sinek has that, famous, I think it's a book, or a lot of what he talks about is this idea of starting with your why, and from there you go outwards to like what you're actually doing.
Yeah.
And so that's part of what this exercise is, to think about your why, like, why am I doing this task? What is the meaning and purpose behind it? Why does it matter? That process of thinking through that and articulating it creates, number one, more order in your mind about the purpose of the task. Number two, it creates higher commitment and buy-in on your end to do the task well. And then, yeah, ultimately, it creates greater focus. So that's why we help people do that. And really, it creates greater focus, greater buy-in, but also greater satisfaction and meaning. And that is essential in all of our work. We're relational beings, so it's really helpful for us to be able to understand how our work is meaningful, not just to us, but also to others.
Yeah, no, that's so true. So then what would you just say to someone who is good at being focused in a task once they start? What if they struggle with procrastination? So even get into the moment is hard. So are there strategies for fighting procrastination?
Yeah, there's a great podcast where Kevin and Sharif address this. I
Okay.
recommend. I don't remember the exact title, but it hits on this topic of procrastination and looked a little bit about the neuroscience. We really believe that it's helpful for individuals, as we're talking about work, to understand what is happening in their mind, when they're working, because the more we understand the mind, it's easier for us to develop strategies that go against maybe bad habits that we have, or habits that could be improved. And so in the case of procrastination, we talk about the illusion of simultaneity.
Okay.
And the illusion of simultaneity is an idea that when you're procrastinating, what happens is that the weight of the tasks seems bigger than it actually is in our mind, because we forget that each task has steps, right? Sequential steps. But in our mind, we see all of the steps kind of in one. And so that creates this feeling of overwhelm, of like this inability to address and enter into this task, like a barrier to entry, essentially. And so how do you break that barrier to entry into a given task? Well, you have to basically respond to this illusion of simultaneity by breaking down the task and figuring out exactly, okay, what are the elements of the task that I have at hand, and what is just the simple next step that I can take? So in short, it all goes back down to this idea of unitasking, doing one thing at a time. So maybe that can be a helpful tip when it comes to procrastination. I heard once someone say, I think this is David Allen, but our mind is meant for having ideas, not storing them. And
Oh,
so when you have an idea that comes to you about the task,
yeah.
write it out, like write out what's on your mind. And that very process of taking and capturing what's on your mind and clarifying it on a piece of paper, I think could be a really helpful step in addressing procrastination and just finding the next best step to take.
Yeah. Actually, I think that's even good advice for just anything in life, like any kind of anxiety or whatever. Just even writing it down just takes it out of your mind and onto like an objective black and white paper. So I agree. So speaking of strategies, so I know OptimalWorks programs are focused on helping people overcome anxiety and distraction. You talked a little bit about how we can focus on eliminating distractions, but what about anxiety? Like what are some examples of strategies that you've seen worked, or and that optimal work promotes?
Yeah, so I mean, it's fascinating to think about what the neuroscience here just for a little bit. So, everything with anxiety is connected to the amygdala, right? And so the amygdala is the part of our brain that has to do with automatic impulses, emotions, thoughts, memories. And so what we help people do through reframing is really to activate their appraisal center, which is in the forward part of their mind, of their brain, which is more connected to abstract thinking, moral reasoning, decision making, ideals. And so this process of taking somebody from the amygdala to their appraisal center is a lot of what the masterclass goes through, and really how we help people address anxiety. And really, the thing that's important with anxiety is to recognize that what's happening is that our adrenaline is being triggered by a task, and that is something that we can activate in a positive way if we're able to see it as an opportunity, right? So our adrenaline can either cause us to see something as a threat, and then we enter into what's called threat mode, but it can also be activated in a positive way to help us be even more engaged in the task at hand. And so I think if I were to give some, just general advice based on what I've learned, and I'm not a neuroscientist or a doctor, but what we talk a lot about in Optimal Work is that the first step oftentimes with anxiety after reframing is just to be mindful, to spend the time to be able to experience what the anxiety is. And sometimes that's a feeling in our chest. And that's why this mindfulness exercises can be so helpful, because again, they help to take us away from this cognitive fusion where we're just so tied to our thoughts that they overcome us and they overwhelm us. And so this breathing exercise, mindfulness, what it does is it helps the individual put all of their attention just on one task. And in this case, it's just their breathing or the sensation in their chest, or even the sensation of anxiety that they might be experiencing at that moment in time. As they become aware of it and enter into it, not trying to avoid it, which actually triggers a worse response, but simply almost with a curious attitude, accepting it and embracing it and being aware of what is going on, not trying to react necessarily. That can be a really helpful first step with, when facing anxiety in our work.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So thinking about the work that Optimal Work does, it's so weird to say that. But it is focused on self-mastery. But what if someone is in an environment where they are just constantly being distracted by other people or other events that are seemingly outside of their control? What advice would you give to somebody who's really wants to put some of these things into practice? They want to work on one task at a time. They want to set challenges, but maybe their boss keeps throwing projects at them, or maybe their coworkers keep stopping by every 5 minutes. What do you recommend then?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the key certainly is not becoming frustrated at those experiences, but really embracing them. And so when it comes to having a quote unquote distraction, we use that term maybe a little bit more technically insofar as when we talk about a distraction, we really mean more the individual giving into a distraction. So, in the case of working, it could be, hey, I pick up my phone, or I have my phone loud and I just, go to it when it pings, versus if you're in a working environment where part of your job is responding to requests, like maybe you're at a front desk, and people are coming in, and that's literally in some ways, the central focus of your work is to talk with people, then it's about welcoming those experiences, not necessarily trying to avoid them, right? If that's not part of the job. And so, yeah, in response to that, I would say the attitude should be to be fully present to whatever the task is. And sometimes the task is somebody came in my office and I need to talk to them. I'm going to give them my full attention. If I treat it in that way, I can go then back to my task and be completely immersed in it. But what takes us off of focus is when we don't welcome something, an interruption, and maybe become frustrated by it. That really is counterproductive. And so maybe the exercise could be working, for example, on the virtue of cheerfulness. It's like, okay, anytime somebody comes by and says hello, I'm going to try to give a great smile and just all of my attention to the person.
Yeah.
So it goes back to being deliberate, finding a deliberate response to a situation that comes up frequently and seeing what we can learn from it.
That makes sense. And I brought up that last example because I've had that experience in previous jobs. And then currently, since I work from home, I have a cat as a roommate. And so I constantly get interrupted, but that's a whole different story. But I guess what would you say, these have been really good strategies, but what would you say has been the one strategy that you've implemented in your own life that has just really made a difference in your own professional journey?
That's a great question. Let me think for a second. If I had to summarize what optimal work is and the strategy that maybe is most important, it's having an attitude of bring it on when a task is in front of you, recognizing that optimal work is essentially about engaging challenge, and if I can get a little theological here, it's a theology of the cross, recognizing that many times what we think is a stumbling block is actually the cornerstone for our growth, for our development, and for the way that we can serve the world. And so for me, it's really identifying, if I had to say one strategy, is just identifying, what is that thing in my work that I'm seeing as a stumbling block right now? And how can it become the cornerstone for me to give the best of myself, and also for me to grow as an individual? I think it all just comes back down to that one habit of shaping our approach, our attitude to our work, and to embrace challenge. So embracing challenge is in summary what I would say is the most important habit.
That is, I really love that. Wow, I'm gonna take some time to think through that because there have been certain situations that have come up at work that have been a source of frustration, but I like the idea of looking at it as like that very thing can be the very area of my growth and that can get me to the next level. So thank you for sharing that. So Bruno, as we get to like the end of our time together, I'd just love for you to just share like, what are some of the programs that Optimal Work offers so that if someone wanted to learn more, they would know where to go and what is offered.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I would say one, you can always find more information on the website, optimalwork.com. And you can email us through that if you have questions. Secondly, I would say the Golden Hour podcast is a great resource that has just so much of really our thoughts on different topics. Kevin leads that with Sharif, and I'm always moved by the topics that they cover in the podcast. So I would highly recommend the Golden Hour podcast along with the website. And really, I mean, our core solution, if you want to systematically go through the ideas of optimal work in a way that's really impactful, is the masterclass. And you can find those resources online for how to go through the masterclass. Currently in my role, I've been working with a lot of institutions that are bringing the masterclass and the principles of optimal work to a corporate setting, and so those are more tailored solutions. But if anyone is interested, they can, again, contact us through the website.
Okay, great. And then Bruno, are there any lasting pieces of advice that you would have for someone as that they can take away with? I mean, you've already given us a lot that they can apply today, right now, in order to be more effective in their work.
I would just say, in short, the way that you shape your work is how you shape your life. So be mindful of that.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Bruno, for joining us. And like he said, please check out the Optimal Work website, and I'll put a link in the video and as well as in the audio. So thank you all for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you, Valentina.
Bye-bye.